And literally, the samosa vendors are packing up and going back to their villages. And if you know anything about India, when the samosa vendors leave and you can't get your samosas, it's a national tragedy. But at a human level, it really is absolutely devastating.
Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-host David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. On May 5th, the three of us recorded a live webinar with Vijay Vitheeswaran, Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor at The Economist. We built this episode around a central tension. The aftershocks of the Iran war are reshaping energy markets, investment decisions, and climate politics in very different ways around the world. On one side are forces accelerating the energy transition, like electrification, EV adoption, solar deployment, and rapidly scaling clean tech. On the other are forces pushing toward deeper fossil fuel lock-in, energy security fears, coal expansion, oil investment surges, and persistent fossil fuel subsidies. Which force is actually winning? Well, have a listen and you be the judge. Now here's the show. We're joined by Vijay Vitheeswaran, who is Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor at The Economist. He's also a winner of the 2025 Energy Writer of the Year Award. He's one of the most closely read voices on global energy, and you know The Economist and its readership around the world. He's got multiple books and cover stories to his name, and as the Financial Times once put it, Vijay is a writer to whom it is worth paying attention. So that's what we need, a writer to whom it's worth paying attention and a thinker. So welcome to Energy versus Climate, Vijay.
Ed, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Only a mother could love. It's a great honor to be on with you, and look forward to the, no doubt, sparky and feisty conversation we will have.
I like that, sparky and feisty. We start early. We start a minute early, and we're going to be sparky and feisty. Let's start, Vijay, just right off the top. Can you characterize, like, what exactly is this latest energy shock, and what's really driving it? And I say that, is it 90% geopolitical in that the Straits of Hormuz have been clogged up, or are there structural and policy elements to it as well? And hopefully I'm not leading the witness with the second part of that question.
You know, there's different ways of answering this, and a lot depends on one's proclivities, right? If you see the world with green tinted glasses, you will see this as sort of something that will accelerate the energy transition, inevitable even. If you see the world from a filter of geopolitics, you will see this with a slightly different analysis, right? So I think multiple things are happening. One thing I would say from my perspective is that this was an entirely unnecessary crisis. This was a war of choice at a moment that was chosen by the United States and Israel. The challenge that it poses to the energy system, and hopefully we'll talk about the climate system relatedly, is one that was predicted, not just could have been predicted, was predicted. That is, Hormuz is one of the most studied straits in the world, right? Even more than Malacca. And so energy thinkers, geopolitical thinkers have thought about this for a long time, what would happen. And now we're pushing the boundaries, and we're finding out that some assumptions weren't true, or at least were facile. The idea used to be multiple scenarios have been done in depth by the Pentagon and others, that somehow it wouldn't make sense for Iran to hold out as long, or one could easily demine this place within a couple of weeks. And so, sometimes these nicely held theories by the best military strategists can only be put to practice, and then you find out exactly what is the ground truth. So there's some dimensions of this that lead to lessons on the geopolitical front and the sort of realpolitik front. For our audience and for our own perspectives, what does this mean for energy? How is this coming in the arc of? Let's remember, 5 decades ago, we had the Arab oil embargo and the knock-on effects, the later shocks emanating from the Iranian Revolution. We've had a couple of major crises. More recently, the gas cutoff in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we've had warning signs that have shaken the foundations of the dominant fossil fuel infrastructure that has powered more than a century of economic growth. And I think that what we're finding now is this shock. And the right question for us to grapple with is, will this too pass? Will this also somehow be absorbed by an incredibly resilient set of market and political and legacy infrastructures? Or could this be coming at a time when there's something new under the sun? literally the sun, the alternatives of, for example, PV, and the low-cost alternatives of battery and PV combined, of electric vehicles, the broader electrification supercycle, that is the tools to think about something else that's meaningful as an alternative system, were simply not available in the 1970s. Or even in 4 years ago, when LNG came to the rescue to Europe, that was still really reinforcing the existing paradigm. And now you have a number of countries saying, well, actually, there's another horse I can jump onto in the middle of the stream. So I think that's the interesting question. Is that what will happen? And what are the reasons that might mitigate against that? Or what are the lingering powers of incumbency? The resilience of the incumbent should not be forgotten. It has been an incredibly powerful set of technologies involving internal combustion, fossil infrastructure. The old joke is, I'm an engineer by background. I was taught as a mechanical engineer, the best substitute for gasoline is gasoline. It's energy dense, it's long-term storage, you can use it anywhere. You get the point, right? So I would explore and kick the tires on what might be the reasons that the green dreams of a rapid transition might have some bumps in the road or might not even happen. There might even be forces going in the other direction as a result of the shock. And that's how I would frame the analysis.
Yeah, and I like your analogy of different actors are jumping on different horses, depending on how they're reacting to the shock. And also just the question of, are we now in a state going forward? You mentioned the 2022 shock. At what point does shock just become the baseline? Are we in a series of shocks, or going forward, does it look like we might be in a permanent volatility regime? But I'd want to spend a little bit of time just looking at the impacts that are happening in different regions. So perhaps, and when we did this bonus show at the middle of March, we talked about it a bit. We talked about Europe and Asia and North America, but I'd love to get your take. So starting, what's happening in Asia? What do we know so far? And is there any sort of clear outlines of what horses, Asian countries are jumping on?
Sure. I've just spent a week in India and before that in Kenya as well. So I have a perspective from the emerging markets, which are hardest hit, as I think obviously our audience will know, for a couple of reasons. One, lots of countries are poor, and lots of poor people in poor countries are historically the very first ones that are affected by shocks of all kinds. And the governments are least able to respond in terms of providing the subsidies that Europeans enjoy at a moment of crisis like this, however distorting, however imperfect. That's what happens. Rich countries are buffeted. The United States, of course, the richest country in the world and the originator of this crisis in many ways, is self-sufficient in energy, broadly speaking. So it's quite buffered, in North America more generally. So these countries are highly vulnerable. They import a lot. And their poorest people often are the ones that will suffer the first shock. And I saw this on the ground in Delhi, just a week ago. Liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, is used for cooking. It was seen as a great success by Modi being able to get rid of, biofuels and cow dung and really providing a cleaner alternative. Well, guess what? It's imported. And literally the samosa vendors are packing up and going back to their villages. And if you know anything about India, when the samosa vendors leave and you can't get your samosas, it's a national tragedy. But at a human level, it really is absolutely devastating. The prices have tripled and may go higher in terms of cooking fuels. That's a small example, but there are bigger examples, of course, with LNG imported by multiple countries at the bottom end of the spectrum, getting priced out by rich countries competing for it. Taiwan, a rich country, relies heavily on LNG and as do Korea, Japan, and so on, and they will outbid the poor countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, countries of East Africa, and we're already beginning to see rationing happen in a number of these countries. And so I think this is a kind of pain, and in particular with product markets, that's another differentiation, right? The oil price that we see in the news for Brent or WTI doesn't reflect the acute pain in specific product markets, down market like diesel or jet fuel, where we're beginning to see the stocks run very low indeed, and particularly in Asia, but also other places outside of North America. So I think we're going to see those markets feel the pain first in those subsectors, not just those geographies.
Yeah, when we spoke in mid-March, we talked about Japan as an example, and it's difficult. You don't mothball nuclear plants for 15 years and then try to dust them off like patio furniture. But it seemed like Japan was doing exactly that as a way of trying to ease its dependence on LNG, which had become very expensive while it's sitting on these nuclear assets. Can you talk a bit about China? Because China is this interesting player in all of this. On one hand, China is also dependent on imported oil and is affected by it, and has obviously played this relatively new for China, this sort of soft broker role. On the other hand, for those countries that are jumping and actors are jumping on a different horse, like you said, everything under the sun, and literally that, like solar panels, they, of course, the breadbasket for solar manufacturing in the world. Do you have any anecdotes of what's happening on the ground there?
Sure. I was bureau chief in China for many years. I opened our Shanghai bureau, and I covered the country, including its energy policies, for quite some time. And that's a country that has, for a very, very long time, been concerned about energy security, right? I mean, if there's a pivot in global economy and global thinking, it is really a pivot from the climate-minded focus of the last 15 years, what I call the age of big climate, it's over, to a security focus. And that was already rising in the wake of the European gas shock, but it's much more so and will be, I argue, the dominant theme going forward in energy thinking. And China has been thinking that way from the beginning. Most of their actions, including lots of investments in renewables, were not done because of climate. They might have done to some degree to local pollution, which was a politically salient issue in China, but they have been absolutely paranoid about a cutoff of oil from the Middle East, oil and gas. And so they've embarked on multiple strategies to diversify their economy, diversify this as much as possible. And as a result, they're hit not so badly compared to many other Asian economies. They're relatively well diversified. They also don't mind politically getting gas from Russia, for example, which is verboten for some countries. And so they've managed to hedge their risks, and the increasing share of renewables generation on their grid, of course, it helps them with domestic energy. And let's remember, they're the world's biggest consumer of coal as well. They have that in their back pocket. They're trying to use it in a different, more thoughtful way than in the past. But nevertheless, they've always seen that as an energy security play. And that's what we're seeing now as well. And so I would say China, in energy terms, is surviving quite nicely and relative to peers in a time of global energy shock. And in terms of political terms, is one of the big winners. As we've argued on the pages of The Economist, China is perhaps the big winner from the global energy shock.
I'd like to now bring in David and Sara and open it up to this question. Let's talk about the underlying forces, and let's talk about winners and losers. On one hand, you've got, and Vijay, you've been talking about sort of some areas of increased solar deployment. The high price of gas drives higher EV adoption. I just read in the newspaper today that we're getting the first imported Chinese EVs into Canada. It's driving electrification. But on the other hand, in a lot of places, it's driving countries back to coal expansion, including in India. There's a surge in oil investment, including here in the Canadian oil sands. And fossil subsidies are sort of du jour for some policymakers again. So which side is actually gaining ground, or both simultaneously true? And maybe I'll turn to you, Sara.
Great. Yeah, I liked your comment, Vijay, about the tinted glasses. Listeners of Energy versus Climate will be unsurprised to learn that mine are mostly green tinted, although with a strong appreciation of that incumbent pushback and incumbent desire to kind of keep things going. I would separate it a little bit into, and I think you sort of did in the asking of the question, Ed, separated it a little bit into the coal versus natural gas and oil questions. I think there's no question that, especially in the near term, coal emerges as a sort of winner or beneficiary of this crisis in terms of, countries turning back towards coal, more towards coal as an option. But I still have some optimism that over the midterm, the kind of just the competitiveness in terms of pricing, as well as things like that localized pollution, mean that it will be possible to kind of go back to this world in which we had coal being displaced by other sources of fossil fuels. I think that it continues to make the case for LNG much harder. Exactly. Again, as you were mentioning, Vijay, the fact that many countries that were sort of, sold on this idea of LNG as a low cost, low pollution, reliable source are then, sort of almost, I would argue for a second time now, the first being after the Ukraine invasion, being faced with this kind of, well, yes, it's reliable and low cost, except for when someone else who's willing to pay more for it than you are needs it. And so I think that, once maybe people might might have been more able to get over, but twice I think there's a very strong memory then of the energy security risks there. But I did a little back of the envelope calculation just to kind of actually for myself too to wrap my head around like what is the scale of the growth in solar we're seeing and how much road transportation oil that we're talking about replacing, because indeed the last times we've seen these shocks, whether it's back to the 70s, where of course one of the things that came out of it was the precursor to the National Renewable Energy Lab in the US, we have more ability to actually deploy a meaningful amount of solar or other forms of energy. So with that long preamble, I'll say I found numbers on the range of around 10,000 terawatt hours would be needed, say, if you wanted to replace all of the road transportation oil today. So around 10,000 terawatt hours to do that. That's comparable, just as another metric, to the total global electricity demand, which is somewhere around 16,000, 17,000 terawatt hours. So actually kind of similar numbers. So what I'm going to say about solar sort of applies to the two somewhat equally. Reaching that 10,000 terawatt hours, if we look at solar's growth, for example, in 2025, there was the equivalent of about 635 terawatt hours of new solar installed. So I'm talking, this is all per year. So it would generate the equivalent of 635 terawatt hours. And in March, apparently China exported about double its 2025 number of panels. Now, this is very all rough and back of the envelope. So, I'm not saying that like this means that, X is going to happen within our energy model, but I think it does mean that the scales that we're talking about of things like solar production, so new solar panel production today is of the order that, if that stayed flat and you were to roll that out globally with all the, challenges of that, you could over the next decade replace all of the oil used in transport with solar power. Again, with a big caveat, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. Obviously the world's way more complicated than that, but I do think it's interesting that for the first time, we are entering into one of these crises where we have a scale of solar that is really material on the global scale of energy. So I think that is something new, and it means that this time really can and may be different than times before.
So, I'm very enthusiastic about the prospects of electrified transport, of the rise of solar. I would even double down on Sara wearing my greener than thou glasses, that it's not just solar, it is the astonishing advance of storage. More progress has been made in scaling up and reducing the cost and extending the lifetimes of storage in the last 5 years than in solar in the last 15 years. And the combination of the two, it's pretty clear. I've seen some recent analysis that'll be published fairly soon by a very reputable source that suggests in many parts of the world now, the combination of solar plus storage at scale is providing round-the-clock firm power at costs lower than incumbent fossils, whether it be coal or gas. And that's always been the Achilles heel of solar. And as we see that combination price point, not just the levelized cost analysis from Lazard that are often cited and then quickly rebutted by the grown-ups in the room who say, well, we all know we need gas on or coal. And then the conversation falls apart. Properly done around the clock pricing is going to be increasingly competitive. And we see this in India, in some ways at the vanguard on this. They have round the clock auctions and they've actually gotten very good prices, and they're driving down the cost of that combination, which provides grid ancillary services and so on. So I think when we really think about meaningful advances, I'm 100% with you. However, I would say that, the impact of this crisis is going to have some knock-on effects. And, I don't know if this is the moment to talk about it, but I do think there in the world of fossil, you had mentioned LNG. There's a winner, a loser, and a wild card from my point of view on the fossil front. And then maybe at some point in our time together, we can talk about what are the headwinds to the greener than thou transition. But I think, in the short term, I think coal is a winner. One has to acknowledge that. Let's see how long-lived it is and when, how quickly the solar plus storage phenomena comes on. But undoubtedly in countries that have coal, we're going to see more coal. We saw this in Europe as well 4 years ago. But in emerging markets, I worry about, the colossus, the Indonesia, the India, the China, the Vietnam, countries that have lots of stocks and they have not yet made sufficient progress in the transition, or have vast assets that are paid down and can be run cheaply. That lock-in will last much longer, and the carbon footprint and the carbon shadow is so worrisome. It's really the number one thing I worry about when it comes to climate is the carbon shadow if that coal is burned. That's a short-term winner and might reinforce bad habits. The loser, I think, is LNG, gas more generally. The idea of a golden age of gas, a bridge to a greener future, I think has taken a serious knock, and not just because of questions about methane and supply chain, which can be managed. We know the methane issue can be managed if done thoughtfully. And honestly, it's in fact because of the reliability. And we've seen the volatility, the price, the security issues. European Commission saying in January, we don't want to replace one dependency for another. Code for don't just get off Russian pipe gas and take American gas. America being seen as unreliable is one of the legacies of the current policy out of Washington. And so I think LNG will be called into question as that very reliable bridge, just as there's a tidal wave of LNG coming from the US particularly. Qatar less so because of the war having attacked the Qatari facilities. But we were expecting in the next 2-3 years monstrous amounts of LNG. Many of these projects are done. They're certainly going to come. What will happen? What will be the price that they'll get? I think it's an open question. Before, it would have been a very different scenario of a golden age. The wild card, and I put this out there speculatively, oil may, if the departure of the United Arab Emirates from leads to the collapse of OPEC, then you have a very crazy period of time in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's now a reasonable speculation as a second most important player in OPEC, the only one that has any significant spare capacity, one that has invested dramatically to expand their operations, one that's actually a world-class operator. ADNOC, the oil company, is actually excellent on technology, on the use of AI, and so on. You're going to suddenly find a big player on the world stage and a weakened OPEC. If we see the taps thrown open or inability to control prices and a collapse in oil prices for an extended period of time, this is very bad news for clean energy. This has historically been an important marker or benchmark for how clean energy investment, venture capital, scaling up capital, all of this. And so it's not going to be good news for a period of time. And so it may reinforce the oil economy for longer than it might have been around otherwise. So I just put that on the table as a winner, loser, and wild card as I see it.
Yeah, perfect segue into actually where I was going to go. So obviously agree with you that this whole crisis highlights security, no question, and agreed with the idea that particularly for LNG, given the competitors, that security equation really makes LNG a loser. But I want to think a little bit about what it really means for the oil market from two perspectives. So if I'm the head of a state, then I think I want to diversify. I want to build up domestic storage. I look at how big the Chinese, strategic reserve, whatever they call their strategic reserve was. I want to look at domestic supply. All those things really make sense if I'm a state that's threatened. But if I'm an oil executive, on the one hand, I'm super excited about these high prices nowadays, and I'm certainly talking a bunch and exploring and nosing around. But when it really comes down to a boardroom decision where I'm kind of inching towards FID on some big oil project that hypothetically is going to happen in response to these higher prices and shortage, I think I'm going to be thinking about the fact that it's taking a long time for my project to come online. Now, obviously, it's different if I'm U.S. shale compared to some ultra deep thing that may be slower. And I'm going to worry that by the time it comes online, all this will have passed. Maybe OPEC will have collapsed and prices will be pretty low and I'll really not do well. And so that's where I wonder about how much private investment will really happen given expectations and what the kind of trade-off is between the legitimate view of governments that might want to encourage domestic supply or storage and the firms that might, they want to make money and they want to, and they have reasonable expectations that oil prices might come down. How do you see that playing out?
Sure. Well, let's take it in buckets. Governments, and by governments, I know you mean oil importing or oil consuming governments as opposed to, Saudi Arabia or something. It was always an excellent idea what happened in the wake of the Arab oil embargo. That is the creation of the International Energy Agency, whose principal requirement is that its member countries have 90 days worth of stock cover, stock and product cover, either the way the U.S. does in salt domes in Louisiana and so on, or commercial stock. So some way of having that buffer, and more countries should do it. Indeed, all countries that should do it. What does this do, though? It's insurance, right? So you have to pay for it. It doesn't come for free. But we are in a riskier world where there'll be some additional expense involved in dealing with or coping with the volatility and the risk of cutoff. And I think the sooner countries wake up to that and do it, including poor countries who might need to be helped in some way to do it, the better. Regional buffers could perhaps help, for example. So that's going to happen and should. I think this has been a pretty salutary lesson. And you hear more and more developing countries lining up with the IEA, which had really been a club of OECD rich countries. Now you're seeing Brazil and India and others. I hope it'll be the poorer countries as well. But in terms of the companies, which is in some ways a more interesting question, leave aside ADNOC and Aramco, there are much of the world's oil is pumped by national oil companies. It is not pumped by Exxon. Exxon is not one of the world's top 10, one of the biggest producers, the private sector companies. And so we have to remember that their incentives are going to be different. And if you're one of the countries in Africa, Latin America, or Asia that is a middling producer, you're high cost. You're probably not highly competent the way that Aramco and ADNOC are with your own technical capacity. And you probably have relatively smallish reserves. And so your incentive might be to pump, baby pump. That is, to, get out as much as you can. In a world in which you're seeing the fortunes turn against oil producers. And so that's going to affect the dynamic. And I say this as a setup to say, then what happens in the boardrooms of Exxon, Chevron, Shell, and their big oil peers? That's a real dilemma. You have several countervailing factors, and I've been in touch with the companies and following their earnings, which have just happened recently, as well as those of the drillers, the Schlumbergers and the Halliburtons, who are a little bit of an early indicator sign of what direction of travel is going. And what I'm hearing at the moment is the shareholder discipline that had taken hold in the wake of the shale boom and bust, where perhaps $300 billion was ultimately lost. Investor capital was lost in that boom and bust. Society benefited, you can argue. Innovation flourished, but those guys lost their money for sure. And so you have winding down of investment in the big oil sector in the last 5 years, underinvestment, the boosters of the industry would say. I think we're going to see a reversal of that trend. I think we're going to see more investment in CapEx. All of the shale drillers actually pointed out, other than some short-term discontinuity in the Middle East where their operations have been bombed and so on, the rebuilding of the Middle East, but especially their clients of big oil are all rushing to lock down prospects in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas that are not in the Middle East. So there's a differentiation of where they're going to go, because the Hormuz problem is seen as a Hormuz problem. They don't see an oil problem. They say we want other provinces. And so I think you're going to see a slight reflex in that direction. I don't think that's the long-term end game for the oil companies, but I do think we're going to see these mixed signals. And as an example, one of the top 3 drillers said they're booked out on shale through most of the rest of the year, for example, when that was not true before Hormuz. So they're seeing uptick even in the shale patch, which was supposedly in America reaching a peak. People are talking about peak Permian. I think we're going to see more application of energy and resources to non-Middle Eastern oil in the short to medium term. And we can talk about the end game as a separate conversation, but that's what I see immediately.
Quick follow-up on the impact of electric vehicles. So I asked my AI how much this war has changed the forecast for quite soon, for 2027, where the kind of before the war forecast was that global sales would be sort of 34% or so of total vehicles, and the AI thinks it's now 35%. So it's not forecasting a big difference, which makes sense to me because the 2027 is pretty short. What I'd love to hear is what you're hearing from the oil business, kind of looking 5 years out, where with plausible growth of EVs over 5 years, obviously I'm quoting sales, what they care about, what the oil market cares about is what fraction of the fleet is EVs, because that's what starts to actually alter demand. And, kind of doing the integrals casually, my sense is kind of 5 years out, certainly less than 10 years out, EVs begin to take a real bite out of demand. And I'm wondering if you agree with that's true, and to the extent that you do or don't, how the oil companies think about that in terms of long run prices.
I mean, we've seen a radical evolution in thinking, even at Exxon, which had held the line on electrification not being a significant factor. 20 years ago, I can remember sitting with their chief economist, and they're absolutely adamant it's not going to be a significant factor. They have changed their perspective on this. even as in their latest sets of scenarios, they don't call them scenarios, but they're, when they look at the future, they see a world in which we use more oil than we do today. They don't see peak oil imminent, but they also allow for more electrification of fleets in their own thinking. So I think there are a couple of factors that will determine the pace at which this advances. One of them has to be, will Chinese EVs, which, let's be honest, they're making the best, the cheapest, the most innovative electric vehicles. They will be the source and supplier of most of the EVs going forward. If there is an anti-China backlash, as there is in a significant number of markets, US and India as an example, you are going to see a slower pace of adoption, even if it might have made sense. So I want to know, what are the non-economic factors like security policy or tariffs that are imposed? Could we see meaningful supplies coming from other countries in the next 10 years? If you give me 10 years, you might see nice EVs coming up from India or other countries that have capacity, right? But they probably won't reach the volumes. It won't be as good. We've seen the US struggle to make EVs that people want to buy, right? And so, and this is relatedly to battery technology, right? The Koreans have decent battery technology, so do the Japanese, but they're expensive. They're not on par at all near CATL or the Chinese innovators. And so there's a couple of ancillary factors one has to answer. What is the pace of progress in developing EVs that are not Chinese? What is the backlash or tariff or security premia that are applied to Chinese goods? That's going to be a factor as well. And the third is, what set of incentives or policies are introduced? And this is country by country. Are you going to have, for example, clunker policies, meaning a fleet turnover? Your assumptions: cars on the road for 20 or 5 or 10 or 20. That makes a huge difference in how quickly we adopt new technology. And so, if there's a clunker tax or a fee-based system that's introduced, I could see a lot faster penetration of EVs without explicit subsidy, even though it's a de facto subsidy, because you're getting the old clunker off the road. And if the road is actually scrapped rather than sent to a poor country, then the climate actually benefits, right? So I would love to see more policies like that, and that would really change the analysis much more so than I think is allowed for in a lot of the scenario planning.
Jay, you'd mentioned that in these volatile times, and it's interesting that maybe volatility is a structural feature. It's not a temporary disruption. And with prices whipsawing, which makes it very difficult to plan energy systems, whether you're a policymaker or an operator of an independent or an operator of an NOC. And I do want to get to energy security as a driver, because we've talked about it a long time and it's only been heightened. But I can't resist the urge to bring it back to Canada, and especially given the base of our listeners, the majority of them here in Canada and many of them here in Alberta. So we've got a federal government that's working with the provincial government kind of hand in glove now, seemingly after years of sort of fractious relations, to plot out and help the Canadian oil and gas sector, both the oil sands, but also conventional and other unconventional forms of oil and gas. You struck me, and I want to better understand the tail risk of a potential OPEC fracture. Because if the UAE does break from OPEC and it sort of harms irreparably OPEC, and then we get these sort of prolonged low price environment for a while, not north of $100, but maybe we get a prolonged $20 oil environment. What is that going to do for some of the more expensive players in places like Canada? And I say this, the markets are kind of speaking here, because we've got Suncor, Cenovus, Imperial, who for a long time have been operating sort of almost like income trusts, in that they haven't been growing. They're like, we're taking our existing assets. We don't think growth in the oil sands is possible. And so we're just going to optimize and squeeze as much cash flow as we can out of them. And the oil sands being a very high cash flow generating asset. And now suddenly they're talking about growth again. And then that puts on the radar screen talks of new pipelines and market access, and some of the folks here locally get very excited. So it's kind of a long, rambling question to ask you. With or Canada, what happens to Canada, and especially in this OPEC breakup scenario you outlined?
I mean, I don't want to over-egg that scenario, right? We have to see what happens. Again, running with the question, and since I raised it in the first place, if it happens that we do see a collapse in oil prices for a prolonged period of time, this will be bad news for people who make oil in an expensive way. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? If you're going to have we've lived through this before, in the 80s when the Saudis plunged the price in order to bankrupt the guys in America. We've seen extended periods of time when prices collapse, and that is not good for high-cost producers of fossil fuels. It's also not good for clean energy, generally speaking, unless solar could be the great exception, because the flywheel effect is advanced so far, and the excess capacity in China, on some metric, they might have 10 years worth of global demand, worth of, panels and soon batteries ready to go, then that hangover effect might keep prices low, even in the teeth of relatively low oil prices. That's possible. So I don't want to preclude that option being available. But I do think, as long as this is a high cost region, it's going to be a challenge to compete against low oil prices. And some of it is by design, right? Sometimes the Saudis do this on purpose to punish competitors. In this case, clearly it's not by design. The rift with the UAE is quite genuine and powerful, is being done for other reasons. And the UAE will maximize production. That's part of why they're doing this, not to be held back by the Saudis who had previously tried to restrict their output. It has been a point of contention for several years now. So that's what I would say. And then you'd have to see, what are the knock-on effects? What are possible responses in Canada, right? So can you dramatically reduce your cost base? I leave it to your Canadian expertise here amongst my fellow panelists today. But I think you have to look to what are your lower cost alternatives.
Yes, and I think it comes down to the legacy operators versus some of the ones who have brought projects online more recently. And some of the legacy operators, Shell before it divested to CNRL, Syncrude, Suncor, they've been up there a while. They've optimized, been able to get their price of production down to levels where it'd be competitive even in a low price environment. I think everyone else, including all the SAGD operators, would not be competitive. But Sara, I know you have lots to say on this topic.
Yeah, but before I get to the Canada of it all, maybe just one comment on the global picture and kind of the supply-demand balance and EVs. I mean, I think it's also worth reflecting on the fact that, much like what matters for the EV demand destruction is the fleet size, what matters for the price is really a lot at the margins around oil demand, right? And so you don't have to, I'm sort of saying something that's somewhat obvious, but I think it's important enough to remember that you don't have to talk about, halving the demand for oil before you make a big change to what's going to happen in the supply demand markets for oil. And I think that's interesting also actually in the context of how countries might choose to respond, because there is, there's certainly the hard tech version of you build up your storage and local supply of oil. And that's a, good step to ensure energy security. But there's a world in which, especially if everybody else is doing it, electrification also provides both the near-term relief to price volatility for those who adopt the electric option. But of course, also if you're able to, eat into the supply-demand balance sufficiently, even, lack of security from one region or from certain countries or things like that becomes much less meaningful as well too. So there's a world where that happens. Coming back to the Canada of it, we just saw over the last week, there was an op-ed arguing that it's not the right time from a former Pathways employee leader, that's the word I'm looking for, that now is not the right time for CCS in Canada. And then we had actually Pathways themselves come out with a media release, I think it was yesterday from when we were recording this, that it said a number of things. But among things it said is, this is a sign that the world needs more Canada oil right now. And now, so we should remove the carbon tax and we will, then build CCS and increase our production. And I find it very hard to take those claims at their face value now, right? I think I would say at this point, they almost logically have to be understood more as negotiation tactics in the Alberta federal MOU, because, first of all, if there's no carbon tax, it's totally illogical that you would do CCS because, why would you spend more money to capture carbon if you aren't being paid for it? And second of all, this volatility that we're talking about, I don't see a world in which that volatility goes away, whether it's because of the, what's happening in the global order, and what's happening with the energy transition. Both of those are going to be pushing for more volatility. And it's very hard to see investors wanting to put, 30 multi-year plus capital in the ground around then. So I guess I'll say I'm highly skeptical of a lot of what the oil and gas industry is saying now about what they're willing to do when it comes to new production, and even more so about these plans for carbon capture and storage, which are just continuously being kicked down the road.
Yes, and always further down the list to plan new production. But Sara, you'd mentioned this former Pathways executive. I think you're referring to Martha Hall Findlay, are you not, who is former VP at Suncor, head of the Canada West Foundation, but now finds herself as a colleague of yours at University of Calgary, if memory serves. You seem to disassociate yourself from her comments.
Well, I think that shows just how much academic freedom and independence there is, which is I think a good thing, right? And my reading of the markets, I would be interested, Vijay, your perspective from energy reporting on what you think about sort of Canada's whole. It's a little bit in the weeds, and it may be our bun fight that nobody cares about outside of Canada. But maybe you can comment a bit about what's happening with carbon capture and storage or not, or do you see that as ever coming to fruition in the Canadian oil sands?
Well, listen, I will not get drawn into a Canadian bun fight, but I'll make some first principles comments. Canada is incredibly interesting because you do encapsulate this dilemma of liberal politics, generally speaking, with a Texan-style red state trapped within, trying to get out, as far as I understand, with the recent move towards referendum for independence in Alberta, making some progress, apparently. This tension is very interesting, and it is a crucible that the world is watching. Again, the first principles that I work on, we will not deal with the carbon problem unless we deal with externalities in some manner. And I think you hit the note exactly right. Why would anybody pay for CCS unless you had to, or there was some reason to do it? Either some incentive, like the IRA tried in the US, the IRA law, unsuccessfully by and large, and having been reversed in part, or there is some sort of carbon pricing or other mechanism. But if we look to the 100-year view of climate change, we have to have negative emissions. We have to remove, in the second half of the century, at the very latest, greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And we'd better start working on ways to do it now. And it's going to be expensive now. Otherwise, it won't get cheaper later. It's not going to magically appear, although we hope people in the labs are working on this. I know I think David and I met, it was almost 20 years ago when you were when I came to your university. And, in effect, you drew on the back of a napkin what would later become carbon engineering. I came to see at No Trees with the launch of it under Occidental's flag at that point. And so, these technologies take a long time to gestate. That was, the better half of 2 decades. I would hope Canada could be a great incubator because you have both. Again, a certain kind of willingness to think about the environment in an almost European way of thinking about long-term, thinking about historical obligations, thinking about the need to sort of step up on the world stage, and also being an important fossil fuel producer. So having the legacy assets, but also the skills of geology, of engineering, of the hard-nosed way that the world actually runs with the 80% of primary fuels still fossil fuels, right? So you have both. So we look to you, and it was a bit disheartening to see a global climate champion as a first move remove part of a carbon tax. That was not encouraging for the rest of the world. I've got the scars on my back of 20 years of writing leaders in The Economist advocating carbon pricing, and a quarter of the world, roughly 27% of global GDP now is covered by some kind of carbon tax or carbon pricing. Too low in many countries, but we're moving in the right direction. We should, when we get to something approximating 100%, I think we'll have much better policies and outcomes coming from the bottom up in investment decisions. So that's kind of how I see it from first principles. Like I say, the bun fights I'll leave to you three.
I was really struck by your comment about the differential impact on LNG compared to oil. I've been thinking more about it. So just to step back, I think I'm the old one in the room, and I actually do have a childhood memory of driving down the U.S., and it would have been 73, when there were lines for gasoline and there was even an odd number of license plates got to fill on even and odd days. And I think it's really interesting, of course, to reflect on all the profound social and technological changes that oil shock created. And thinking about your comment about the difference between oil and LNG, I want to sort of distill it down and see if I've got it right. I guess the way I would say it is, oil is, at least for some uses, just kind of fundamental and close to priceless. You want to run an airplane, it's just very hard to imagine any other way to do it. And it's not that expensive to store oil. We could, countries that are vulnerable could build out more storage comparatively cheaply and quickly. Whereas for LNG is mostly, first of all, it's still growing. There isn't a giant LNG infrastructure the way there is a giant existing oil infrastructure. LNG is in its growth phase. And it mostly competes, other than chemicals, against electricity, which is solar and nuclear or whatever on the margin, or heat. And for those competitive measures, there is a competitor. Then you'd say, if this has highlighted the importance of security and volatility for both, for oil, it may not make that much difference because we still need oil so much and we can store. Whereas for LNG, it may make a big difference because there really is a choice. And so that's why LNG really is worse off. Is that your argument?
I think in broad brush, that's correct. The only footnote I'd put to that, or sort of, a possible modification to that, is for that subset of countries that have gone down the electrification path already in a significant way. And there is evidence the electro state is advancing in the developing countries. I'm actually working on a cover briefing for The Economist on this. And the rates of electrification, for example, in India are higher now than they were at a comparable stage of development in China. It's more electrified than China was, in part because the tools of electrification, like two-wheelers that are battery swapped and EVs and electrified heat, even in industry to some degree, are made by China at an affordable price already. China itself didn't have that. They had to invent the tools of their own future. They're readily available at a subsidized price for the world now. So I would just say the countries that are doubling down on this and are willing to see that as an option to oil because it's at hand, oil may still have a challenge, but there are many countries that are not in that position, or they have other domestic reasons or legacy reasons, or they have a domestic car maker that's not ICE engines, and they're not interested. The lobbies play a role in all of this. So this is a chance to leapfrog ahead off of oil, but it's not necessarily one that every country will take.
Vijay, I'm wondering, I want to pivot, and we're going to get to a question or two, but I want to talk about sort of looking ahead for the future. And at this point, if we're having this conversation in, let's say, 2 to 3 years from now, and we've been unpacking this question of which road are we going down to, or are we going down them simultaneously? Are we going down the energy transition road? Are we going down the fossil fuel lock-in road? And sort of energy security is sort of justification for countries and IOCs and NOCs to really lock in fossil fuels. But if we're having this conversation 2 to 3 years, what are the indicators that we would pay attention to tell us which of those roads going down? Is that oil demand growth versus plateau, emissions, EV adoption in India, coal build-out trajectory? In your position, what are you watching for?
I see the road ahead. The world faces twin challenges. One is, in my view, certain. That is the energy challenge. That is, we're going to use a lot more energy going forward. And this is going to happen driven primarily by the developing world, air conditioning load, demographic dividend in India and Africa of 1 billion people each, as well as, of course, the electrification of transport globally. We're going to use a lot, and AI in rich countries, particularly the US in certain nodes. But let's not over-egg that omelet. There's going to be a lot more energy consumed in future. Concomitantly, there's a second crisis and challenge, which is the climate challenge. And I think I'm confident that the first challenge will be met by us using more energy, dirty or clean, especially in developing countries. They're going to grow. They're going to use the energy that's available and affordable for their people. I hope and pray and I advocate for action on the second challenge. And my belief is that there are forces that can lead to something of a positive flywheel effect where the two can be met. I'm so pleased to be part of a conversation on energy that hasn't mentioned AI yet, thank goodness. But there are, we don't need to go off on that side trail, but I would posit that the electrification trend globally, the astonishing decline in prices of clean firm power, which is related but not the same, as well as what I would say AI emerging as a climate superpower, not the way it's billed in American politics as driving costs up for granny and so on. That's been roundly debunked by the Livermore, by the Berkeley study, I should say, the Lawrence Berkeley study and others. But if we used and done properly as a tool for transformation of the power grid, as well as multiple other tools for climate, I think we can see an outcome where there is more energy and it's a lot cleaner going forward. But that is a world in which there will also be more fossil fuels used. That's why, again, we didn't get into a long debate about peak versus not peak and which day and month there's going to be peak and what. But I think that's how I see the world, that there's going to be a lot more energy use. And I'm going to work as hard as I can to make sure that most of it is as clean as possible, especially at the point of use as electricity.
We're going to bring in number one EVC fan and former host of Energy versus Climate, Rob Tremblay.
So just a question, I guess, just going back to, I think you all were talking about LNG imports and just solar's ability to kind of replace some of that gas. So I think, usually when we're thinking about replacing gas on the electricity system, I think we're often thinking about replacing gas units. And in that kind of frame, clean and firm really matters. And as lots of folks know, I'm a pretty big fan of storage. But I guess in this specific context, isn't storage really only important insofar as it allows more terawatt hours of solar to make it to end consumers? When we're thinking about the shocks from, LNG price spikes, isn't solar really more important just about displacing how much gas is burned on the grid as opposed to, replacing gas units? And does that kind of lead to almost a different role for solar in this kind of specific context than we usually think about on the grid?
Take a stab at that. So I think, Rob, if I understand what you're saying, is that especially now the solar that's coming in doesn't necessarily need to be so firm because we're still talking about more like peak shaving and things like that. And I guess what I would say to that is, I think pretty quickly, because of the pace that it's possible to install solar, you pretty quickly can get to the point where you have so much solar that you do need to start time shifting it. But as Vijay said, the storage piece is becoming has become so cheap that that's not really a problem. I will say, I think one of the other things that's interesting about solar in this kind of like response to the crisis that didn't come up so much so far is like, when we think about the response to price shocks, there are actions that the governments can take in this very like centralized way, but there's also sets of actions that individuals can take in a very disaggregated way. And in previous price shocks, that second group, those disaggregated actions were much more limited to things like conservation and which, you can do something, but can only go so far. And I think what's also interesting, what I'll be watching kind of coming out of this, is that this is really, I would argue, the first energy crisis that we're facing in that way, where there's more of these individual clean levers for people to pull, namely putting solar on their own rooftops, and particularly in countries that may not have, great grids. And so I think there could be a bit of a, leapfrog effect coming there, whether that's paired with storage or not.
To what degree, Vijay, has China now positioned itself as, not just having strategic oil reserves, but it's got strategic reserves of the clean tech that the world is going to need? I mean, some have written about the problem that it had overcapacity, and especially with any kind of global downturn. That overcapacity has really done China a favor. Well, now that we go through this shock and people are looking at lessening demand and solar panels are flying off the shelves, is China an outright winner given this price shock?
I mean, they're well hedged, right? So this was done as an energy security play, was done as a mercantilist play, right? China wanted to sell to the world, and they've certainly positioned themselves well for that. Don't ask what the price was, right? The subsidies are hidden in multiple ways, but it's part of their economic system. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to declare this as a complete outright winner, because how aggressively they played their cards. We're seeing the backlash. I mean, I was very disheartened to see in Britain just recently plans for investment by one of the leading Chinese wind players, 1.5 billion pounds sterling, I believe, to invest in making wind components and supplying a project with Octopus, the leading UK utility, very innovative company. They wanted to use wind and really develop it based on security grounds. The company's been blocked. We saw this earlier in Germany, where an offshore, the same company, Mingyang, one of the world's leaders, was blocked from a project. They were booted out, and the local champion, Siemens, was given the turbine contract. And on very unspecified, vague security concerns that are, in my view, should be investigated. There are ways to be smart about security and see which areas of security are legitimate and should be domesticated or indigenized, what areas can be ring-fenced, and what are general areas of concern. Cyber hacking can come from non-state actors, not just Chinese. So or human error. You should do the same things to make your wind farms safe and secure, and not being able to take down the grid, whether or not they're Chinese components. So I think there's a kind of a sloppiness to the jingoism and xenophobia that actually China has some responsibility in that, the way it's overplayed its cards. So I don't know that they're a complete winner. And if there's a massive backlash, then it'll be a handful of countries that don't mind. Maybe there's, developing countries that, or they're already in the Chinese camp, or they don't really see a threat. It's a gift to the world. And I think, the countries that accept the Chinese technology with appropriate safeguards will be great winners, not just China as the winner.
Great. You know what? It's been a great conversation. I've managed it poorly because we're bumping up against the clock. So with questions, we're going to be one and done, but we do have enough time to do a closing round of thoughts. And I will turn to David first.
I'm going to step back again to this idea of how things change with oil shocks and think about what it means for decarbonization and kind of come down on Sarah's side that I think this really is different from previous shocks because we're really almost there for competitive renewables. And I think about it the following way. Next year, just sort of no big forecast, the world will produce about 2 terawatt hours of battery capacity and about 1 terawatt of PV. So what that means is within just a few years, or 3 years, you make 3-4 terawatts of PV easily. That's not even counting growth. And that means you're making enough PV to produce a terawatt or so of average power. And again, in just a few years of that kind of storage capacity, you could make 24 terawatt hours of storage. And that means really in just a few years, the world is positioned to make something of order of a terawatt of firm solar capacity, which is just kind of stunning. And, that's in a world where total electricity demand is like 3.7 or so terawatts as of today. So that doesn't mean it's easy. There's all sorts of ways it's hard, and that's only a third of it. And we have to, convert EVs. But it means that these things can really be material in a way they couldn't before. And I feel like the fact that they're material and competitive and stable at the same time as there's a shock is going to tend to drive them faster in ways that will matter in the long run, even though it's going to be true that people will also build up oil and gas in some ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you said, I think I agree with a lot of that. And looking back, it feels like we've been talking for, 5-10 years about this is coming. And now it's like, this is really coming within, the next 5 to 10 years. So I think I still worry, putting on my Alberta hat, I still worry that we're not really aware to the magnitude of changes. I want to come back to kind of the energy security and what that looks like. And the points that you made, Vijay, about the, how much power you give to a given country and all those things, I think are really well taken. It goes back almost, I think, 5-6 years ago now. I was on a webinar with the IEA with Nikos Tsafos, who was at the time with CSIS. And he made the comment that, energy security when it comes to oil and gas is, of course, very much supported by this, intense global order and global, security that exists as well, too. And so I think we are entering a time where it's not that electricity, is inherently requires less security, maybe a little bit less because it can be a little bit more localized once you have the different technologies in place and you're not having to continuously buy. There is a sort of somewhat shorter time scale because you don't actually burn the fuel. But that said, that it's not that, we completely get rid of our energy security concerns, but rather that they just change form. And that's going to require a whole new set of thinking. I think this conversation has really kind of crystallized that for me. But nonetheless, I think as David said, I come out optimistic here that the last kind of big shock that we had and big push from the US got us a pretty good jump on towards decarbonization. And this next one may now come at a time where we're really pushing across that, materiality line, if you want.
I'll make a couple comments and then we'll give last word to Vijay. It really feels to me, I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as Sara and as David. We're making 2050 climate decisions or decisions that will impact the climate and the problem in 2050 based on a 2026 security lens. And it really feels, thanks to Trump, once again, security trumps long-term climate and decarbonization as the dominant force. And it's only when you can actually merge security with decarbonization and cost that you get this magic mix where we get a solution that works for the climate, works for security, and is implementable. So, goals haven't changed. I really look forward, like I said, in sort of 2 years from now, it's kind of a tale of two cities, or to mix metaphors, two roads. And I'd love to, I'll put it out there, Vijay, to have you back in a couple of years to see which of those roads we've gone further down. I should say, while I'm not quite pessimistic, I'm not as optimistic as my colleagues here. Over the long term, I still remain optimistic that I think we are getting a handle on the climate problem. It's just the next 30 years that have me deeply worried. All right, Vijay, over to you. Last word.
Great. So, I think this is the most optimistic time, most hopeful time for the advance of clean energy and related trends of electrification, of empowerment, of distributed energy. We didn't talk much about that. And certainly, in contrast with the shocks of 50 years ago, the tools are available, the costs are declining fast, the reliability is increasing, and the security benefits, to go slightly against your point, Ed, I think actually renewables and clean energy benefit from a security shock because the imports of fossil fuels have shown themselves to be unreliable, volatile, highly priced, in contrast to homegrown energy, which is overwhelmingly will be clean, except for a handful of countries that have coal. Having said that, I'm very much in this camp. I want to put down a marker for what I call the dirty half dozen of challenges that I'm going to watch for. So that when we get together in a couple of years, I will be watching for progress the world makes in overcoming these challenges so that the flywheel of clean energy takes off even faster. First, does OPEC collapse and will cheap oil really kill renewables? We're going to be watching for that, or what policies can be implemented on that. Second, whether it's droughts or Dunkelflaute, when you have outages of clean energy, or you often find a reversion to coal, for example. We saw that in Brazil. We saw this in China. We saw this in Scandinavia. So be aware there can be a swing in the pendulum. There's not a march towards, peak anything. Third, renewables are capex heavy, even though the OPEX is free or nearly free. And so that is difficult in a world of, let's say, longer for higher interest rates that affects capex heavy projects. That's a headwind to watch out for in the global environment. The world is getting riskier, in part because of damage wrought by climate change itself and other reasons. A more volatile, security conscious world, and developing countries, broadly speaking, where most of this revolution needs to happen, they already have a risk premium that's too high applied for projects like clean energy projects, and that could make it worse to get the investment that one needs in these markets in very sensible technologies of clean energy. Fifth, the supply chains are a real problem. And especially as the world moves on an anti-China kind of backlash on these very affordable, clean, and proven technologies, and let's say you get them from India or you get them from domestic sources, they're going to be more expensive. Supply chains are going to get bunged up. That raises the cost of clean energy, could bung up the transition. And finally, and top-thumpingly, the 7 trillion plus in direct and indirect subsidies provided to fossil fuels that the IMF has documented. If you want to be rigorous about it, $1 trillion plus in direct subsidies, the government's need to phase out with enthusiasm and aggression. The G7 promised to do it in Pittsburgh. Hasn't happened. It's only going to get worse with this global energy shock. We're going to put more subsidies and perverse distortions in place. I think that's the single most powerful thing we could do is eliminate the harm and then think about externalities pricing of some kind. I'm going to watch for progress on those dirty half dozen so that I can join the enthusiasm of my colleagues on this webcast.
Yes, the perennial fossil fuel subsidies question. That is a terrific dirty half dozen list, and we'll be watching for them as well, Vijay. Very well said. Thank you so much for the time. We started early. Now I've let us run overtime, but that's because we had such a rich conversation. We're very grateful for you coming on Energy versus Climate.
It's been great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our earlier conversations with International Energy Agency Chief Energy Economist Tim Gould on the IEA's annual World Energy Outlook reports. The first is Season 4, Episode 4, IEA Energy Scenarios, and the second is Season 5, Episode 6, Energy versus IEA Oil and Gas Scenarios. Both tackle many of the same questions around energy security, fossil fuel demand, and the forces shaping the global energy transition. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Emmett Tandon with help from Michael Edmonds. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with the support of the North Family Foundation, the Conscon Foundation, the Trottier Family Foundation, and you, our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This is our last scheduled show of the season, but trust us, we'll be back with bonus content in the weeks to come.